Here's how the West learned to hate itself. It all began with an unusual moral habit. The West taught people that recognizing their own faults was a virtue. And initially, that was one of its greatest strengths. Christianity placed enormous importance on confession, repentance, and examining your own conscience. The message wasn't, look at what everyone else is doing wrong. It was, before judging others, examine yourself. So, real strength wasn't just defending yourself, it was admitting when you were wrong. Then the Enlightenment expanded that habit beyond the individual. Now it wasn't just people who could be questioned. Traditions could be questioned. Religion and governments could be questioned. Eventually, the culture itself could be put on trial. Again, this was a strength. A civilization willing to criticize itself can abolish slavery, reform corrupt institutions, and correct its own mistakes. But this also created a psychological vulnerability, because once self-criticism becomes associated with intelligence and moral virtue, people begin competing to show who is the most self-critical. It is no longer enough to admit your country has flaws. You gain more moral credit by portraying those flaws as uniquely unforgivable. Recognizing the strengths of other cultures, which is often valuable, gradually becomes something different. Their traditions become authentic. Ours become oppressive. Their group loyalty becomes community. Ours becomes nationalism. Their religious conservatism becomes cultural identity. Ours becomes backwardness. The same behavior is judged by different standards depending on whose culture it belongs to. This is where healthy self-criticism begins turning into cultural self-contempt. The two world wars accelerated this process. After fascism, the Holocaust, and the collapse of the European empires, many Western societies became deeply suspicious of nationalism and increasingly focused on confronting their own historical failures. Taking responsibility for genuine wrongs was necessary, but over time, for many people, guilt slowly became something closer to shame. And there's an important psychological difference. Guilt says, we did something wrong. Shame says, there is something fundamentally wrong with us. One motivates repair, the other produces self-contempt. The problem isn't criticizing your own culture. Every civilization should be willing to confront its failures. The problem begins when criticism stops being a search for truth and becomes a source of moral status. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The West didn't become this way because it followed Christ too closely. It became this way because it stopped halfway. Christ never taught people to examine themselves so they could hate themselves. He taught them to examine themselves so they could be redeemed. Repentance was never meant to end in shame. It was meant to end in transformation. Somewhere along the way, we kept the self-examination, but abandoned the redemption. And once redemption disappeared, there was nothing left to stop self-criticism from becoming self-contempt. That's how the West